That morning the dust hung so thick in the air that it mixed with the stench of 10,000 men who hadn't washed since marching what felt like 1,000 miles. Danger pressed in on us from every direction. Starvation nipping at our heels, Turkish forces closing around us, and a fortified city standing stubbornly in our path. And yet, within just a few hours, something none of us believed possible would unfold. But before I explain how we reached that moment, I have to rewind about 3 weeks, to when Frederick Barbarossa made a choice that would end up echoing through history. So let me take you with me for a minute, back across those blistering plains of Anatolia, where death seemed to be stalking us from every angle. It was May of 1190, deep into the Third Crusade, a campaign that was supposed to be this great union of Christian armies. While Richard the Lionheart and Philip Augustus took the safer sea route, Barbarossa, true to his nature, chose the long overland march straight through hostile territory. Folks called him Redbeard, and at 68, the man had nothing left to prove to anyone. For decades of battles had already turned him into a legend. But there he was anyway, guiding nearly 100,000 of us straight into the enemy's homeland. Across the field stood his rival, Sultan Arslan II, the Lion Sword, a master of the Turkish style of war. For 20 years he ruled the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, gripping Anatolia like it belonged only to him. His cavalry archers were terrifying to watch, fast as lightning when they attacked and gone like smoke before you even raised your shield. No Western force had managed to carve its way through his lands in anyone's living memory. But Barbarossa hadn't survived 40 years of war by missing the small things. While younger commanders stared only at Turkish strength, he studied their habits. He saw how the Seljuks depended on speed and volleys of arrows, always sidestepping close combat. Over the years, their confidence had curdled into something like arrogance. They simply couldn't imagine a Western army lasting long enough in the heat of Anatolia to truly threaten them. Our march had been nothing short of a nightmare. We started with a sea of 100,000 men, but disease, desertion, and all those constant hit-and-run attacks whittled us down to maybe 15,000 left standing. Wells were poisoned, food burned, and every single mile demanded a price in lives. The Turks never let up. Arrows whispering out of nowhere, raiders slashing through our camp at night, tricks meant to break our spirit. Men dropped in their armor from the heat. Horses died faster than we could bury them. But Barbarossa just kept pushing us onward. His commanders pleaded with him to turn around. The Duke of Swabia urged a retreat to friendlier lands. The Bishop of Würzburg begged the heavens to intervene. But the old emperor noticed something they didn't. The Seljuks were predictable. They fought exactly as their fathers and grandfathers had fought. They hadn't adjusted to the raw, crushing force of disciplined heavy cavalry when it moved in tight formation. Their power centered around Iconium, modern-day Konya. That place wasn't simply a city. It was the beating heart of Turkish rule in Asia Minor. Its triple walls had never fallen. Its 5,000-man garrison was well dug in, and whoever controlled it held the key pass toward Syria and the Holy Land. Taking Iconium meant shattering the Seljuk hold over the region. But Kilij Arslan made a mistake that would cost him everything. Instead of gathering all his strength, he split his forces. One part defended the city, another shadowed us, and the biggest portion, his main field army, waited patiently to deliver what he thought would be the final blow once we were at our weakest. He figured time was on his side. Let the Crusaders wear themselves out battering Iconium's walls, then crush whatever remained. Barbarossa, though, had spent those 3 weeks studying every move the enemy made. Our knights still had their heavy armor. Our men, though barely hanging on, kept their discipline. And the emperor had pinpointed the Sultan's blind spot. He was reliable to a fault. The Turks always fought the same pattern: harass, wear down, then swarm. They never imagined that a starving, exhausted force might choose to attack instead of defend. Then word came one early morning in May. The Sultan's main army was closing in, 40,000 warriors, fresh and full of confidence. We were stuck between the city walls and this incoming storm. Any normal commander would have ordered a retreat or dug in for a desperate last stand. But Barbarossa, with that lifetime of reading battlefields like other men read books, chose neither. And so, On the dawn of May 17th, both sides braced for a clash that would reshape the way medieval warfare was understood. That morning, Barbarossa counted what was left of us. Only 10,000 men were still fit to fight. Out of our vast host, just 2,000 knights still had horses. Most of those poor beasts little more than skin and bone. 8,000 infantry, exhausted but stubborn, tightened their grips on their weapons and waited for whatever would come next. By the time we reached that miserable point, we'd already lost 5,000 men. The ones who were still standing were the toughest, most stubborn fighters Christendom had left to offer. Our leadership read like a who's who of German nobility. Frederick V or Frederick VI, depending on who you asked, Barbarossa's own son, commanded the vanguard. He was only 23, burning with youthful fire but already shaped by his father's hard-earned wisdom. Count Robert of Nassau led the men from the Rhineland, veterans who'd survived more campaigns than they cared to count. Markwart of Neuburg headed the emperor's personal guard, a tight, disciplined band of 500 who had sworn to die before letting any harm come within reach of Barbarossa. Every one of these men brought something crucial to the table. Siege expertise, cavalry tactics, infantry discipline, the whole toolbox of medieval warfare. Meanwhile, the Seljuk forces facing us were nothing short of overwhelming. Inside Iconium, 5,000 garrison troops held the walls no army had ever managed to break. They stood 30 feet high, 10 feet thick, lined with towers spaced every 100 yards. They had stashes of Greek fire and enough supplies to last for months. The triple gate system meant that even if you broke through the first wall, you'd barely be inside the city at all. To make matters worse, the Sultan himself, Kilij Arslan, approached from the east with his main force. 40,000 men, perhaps more. Some Turkish accounts bragged of 65,000. 20,000 of them were elite cavalry archers who practically lived on horseback. Each carried 2 bows and around 150 arrows. These weren't peasants shoved onto a battlefield. They were lifelong warriors who could send off a dozen accurate shots in a minute while riding full speed. Behind them marched 15,000 infantry. Spearmen, swordsmen, solid troops who held the line while the cavalry tore armies apart. Another 5,000 were irregular Turkmen eager for loot. The Sultan had every reason to feel confident. His scouts told him what he wanted to hear. We were exhausted, low on supplies, and watching our horses drop dead daily. The heat hit 95 degrees and fighting in full armor, 250 pounds of metal under that blazing sun, felt like suicide. Turkish officers mocked the idea that we still had any fight left in us. What could 10,000 worn-out crusaders possibly do against fresh armies and a fortified city? But buried in our ranks was something the Turks had never truly faced in its full fury. Disciplined heavy cavalry acting in tight, perfect coordination. Every knight was the product of decades of training. Every remaining destrier, our big, powerful warhorses, had cost more than some villages. When 2,000 of these riders hit as one, they slammed into enemy lines with a force not unlike a modern tank battalion. Then Barbarossa shocked us all. On the night of May 17th, he split the army. Military doctrine screamed that dividing a smaller force was asking to die in pieces. His commanders objected across the board. Duke Frederick wanted to keep everyone together. Count Robert suggested negotiating. But after 40 years of battle, the emperor understood something they didn't. Sometimes the boldest move was the one that worked. His plan sounded insane, almost elegant in its recklessness. Duke Frederick would take 3,000 men, 700 of them knights, and march straight up to Iconium's gates. The hope was simple. The garrison, seeing such a small detachment, would burst out to crush it. Meanwhile, Barbarossa would take the remaining 7,000 men to meet the Sultan's massive army head-on. Both groups were outnumbered at least 5-1. On paper, neither force stood a chance of surviving. The psychological warfare started before dawn. Turkish horsemen rode in lazy circles just outside crossbow range, shouting insults and waving captured crusader banners. They described in vivid detail what they planned to do to us once the fighting began. Some of our men cracked under the taunts. Morale, already barely holding, wavered hard. Then Barbarossa appeared among us. Even at 68, the man radiated strength, calm, steady, almost amused by the whole situation. His presence alone stitched our nerves back together. "Tomorrow," he told us quietly, "we remind them why their grandfathers feared the Iron Men of the West." That night, our priests held mass. Many knights confessed their sins, certain that the next day would be their last. The infantry sat sharpening their weapons one final time. Meanwhile, in the command tent, Barbarossa and his inner circle went over every detail again and again. Timing mattered more than anything. Duke Frederick had to break through the gates just as the Sultan's main force collided with ours. Too soon, and the garrison would reinforce. Too late, and we'd be swallowed whole before he ever reached the walls. What most people didn't know was that Barbarossa had one more card hidden up his sleeve. He had kept the best of his knights, the 500-man Imperial Guard, untouched by earlier fighting. They had fresh horses, the last fresh mounts we had left. Their armor, despite everything, was still in fighting shape. These men had trained together for years, drilled to form the dreaded Iron Wedge, a formation that could tear straight through almost any line. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the Anatolian hills, Barbarossa summoned his son and gave him orders that defied every rule of war. And so, in the dim light before dawn on May 18, 1190, our two crusader columns slipped apart, each one moving into the darkness to take its place in a plan most of us believed would get us killed. Duke Frederick led his 3,000 men straight toward the gates of Iconium. Our smaller column marched in plain sight, making no effort to hide. The Turkish sentries just stared, stunned that we seemed to be walking straight to our own deaths. Barbarossa set up our 7,000 men on a gentle rise about 2 miles from Iconium, spreading us wide with cavalry on the flanks and infantry in the middle. To anyone watching, it looked like we were digging in for a hopeless last stand, and that's exactly what he wanted the Sultan's scouts to believe. The first arrows came with sunrise. Turkish horse archers swept in, riding their familiar crescent pattern, and suddenly the air filled with a storm of arrows. One chronicler wrote the sky turned black with 10,000 shafts. But we weren't backing up anymore, we were ready for this. After 3 weeks of being harassed the same exact way, our knights knew the pattern. As the arrows poured down, we lifted our shields in one smooth motion and overlapped them like scales. Losses were small. By mid-morning, Duke Frederick reached Iconium's walls. The garrison commander hesitated. 3,000 of us couldn't break his defenses, but letting us roam free outside the city would let us prepare a siege. Pride settled it for him. Why hide behind stone when his cavalry could crush a tired handful of Christians? The gates opened and 2,000 garrison riders charged out, sure of an easy win. But Frederick had set the trap perfectly. Our infantry formed tight spear squares. The few crossbowmen we had aimed for horses. His 700 knights waited like coiled springs, expecting panicked men fleeing for their lives. The Turkish cavalry instead slammed into steady resistance and lost all momentum. Back at our position, Barbarossa kept playing the long game. Arrows kept falling, men dropped, and ranks closed instantly. In the distance we saw the dust cloud of the Sultan's full army, 40,000 strong, rolling toward us. Drums pounded and war cries carried across the plains. Their confidence only grew when they saw how worn down we looked. Even our horses drooped like they could barely stand. The Sultan rode up to a low hill, his green silk banner bright in the sun, prepared to watch us get erased. But then his scouts reported something he hadn't expected. Duke Frederick was fighting outside Iconium, and the gates were wide open. The garrison commander tried to pull his cavalry back, but it was too late. They were already locked in a desperate, chaotic fight. Worse, our infantry was pushing toward the open gates. The Sultan had to choose: ignore the city, split his army, or smash us fast and hope Iconium held out. He chose pride and numbers. 40,000 against 7,000 sounded like an easy hour's work. What he didn't know was that Barbarossa had shaped this exact moment for 3 weeks. Our knights had been secretly fed the last of the horse rations. The Imperial Guard stayed hidden in the center behind the infantry, and he'd picked ground where a downhill charge would give us every advantage. The Turkish assault hit full force. Wave after wave of mounted archers swept in, loosing volleys before pulling away. One account claimed 30,000 arrows flew in the first 10 minutes. Our line bent but held. Shields up, gaps filled, discipline never breaking. Still, their tactics were wearing us down. Holes opened faster than we could close them, and both wings started to sag under the pressure. Turkish cavalry moved in closer, sensing the kill. Their infantry got ready to turn a wobble into a rout. The Sultan's banner pushed forward. Victory looked seconds away. And then, right at noon, everything erupted. At Iconium, Duke Frederick's knights smashed into the tangled garrison cavalry. And in the main battle, Barbarossa lifted his arm and gave the signal. Trumpets blasted, and our center suddenly split open like a doorway. Out rode 500 untouched knights, the Imperial Guard, mounted on the last strong horses we had. They formed the old Germanic iron wedge, a formation built for pure destruction. Watching from his hill, the Sultan felt the first flicker of fear. These weren't tired, broken riders. These were fresh, armored monsters on full-strength destriers, and they were already picking up speed. Our infantry stepped aside with practiced timing, and the trap snapped shut. The Turkish cavalry, crowded in close and hungry for the kill, had nowhere left to maneuver. They'd followed us right into the kill zone. 2,000 Crusader voices roared, "God wills it," as every mounted man joined the charge. At the exact same moment, chaos erupted at Iconium. Duke Frederick's 700 heavy knights smashed into 2,000 light cavalry, who were still turning to meet them. The collision was brutal. Our lances punched through their thin armor, and our war horses slammed their smaller mounts into the dirt. The garrison commander watched his careful battle plan collapse as his cavalry was crushed between Frederick's knights and our infantry squares. Then he realized the worst of it. He'd left the city gates wide open. Our infantry was already sprinting for the entrance. He screamed for the gates to close, but panic hit his men like a wave. Both sides piled into the entryway, bodies jamming the passage as they fought in a frenzy. Inside the walls, the fighting spread fast. Dozens of Crusaders pushed through, then hundreds. Civilians scattered in terror, and narrow merchant streets turned into killboxes. Frederick, bloody sword in hand, drove straight toward the citadel. The Sultan's younger brother, holding the citadel, faced a nightmare. His troops were dying in the streets, civilians clogged every path, fires were starting to spread, and he chose to seal himself inside the citadel, abandoning the city to save his last stronghold. That decision shattered Turkish morale. But the garrison had one last move. Around 500 veterans who'd missed the first charge gathered in the market square and rushed toward the gate, hoping to slam it shut and trap us inside. Frederick was too deep in the city to stop them. Meanwhile, 2 miles away, Barbarossa's real trap came to life. The Imperial Guard thundered downhill in their wedge, 500 fresh knights, each man and horse carrying about 600 pounds of steel and gear. Behind them rolled 1,500 more knights, exhausted but still ready for one last strike. The sight was terrifying even to us. A steel arrowhead of men and horses aimed straight at the Turkish center. The Turkish cavalry archers, packed in too tight, suddenly faced the nightmare they always avoided. No room to turn, no space to shoot, and a wall of armored riders closing fast. Some tried to run, others tried to stand their ground. It made no difference. 30,000 arrows had flown earlier, but at close range against plate armor, they might as well have been raindrops. At the front, Markward of Newburgh and the other lead knights lowered their lances. The formation was perfect. A single ripping point of steel and fury racing downhill. Behind them came 1,500 more, the sound like the earth itself tearing open. From his hill, the Sultan finally felt true fear. His men were bunched up, tangled from their overeager pursuit, and completely unprepared for a head-on heavy cavalry charge. He shouted for solid ranks and spears forward, but his army had never trained for a stand-and-hold fight. One young knight, Wilhelm of Tübingen, later wrote, "As we charged, the world slowed. My lance felt weightless. I saw Turks trying to run. Then everything became steel, screams, and splintered shields. And just when the Turks thought they understood what was coming, Barbarossa unleashed the real killing blow. He ordered a feigned retreat on both wings. Our flanks pulled back, not in panic but in perfect control. The Turkish wings lunged forward, thinking they'd broken us. In doing so, they left their center exposed, right in front of the charging wedge. Then came the horn blast. Barbarossa sounded it himself, a single clear note every crusader knew by heart. General attack. No more holding the line. No more waiting. Every man who could lift a weapon was to surge forward. The effect on the Turks was immediate and devastating. Warriors who believed they were moments from victory suddenly faced a revived enemy charging with fresh fury. The iron wedge was a sight I'll never forget. 500 knights formed up in a widening triangle, each row stretching broader than the one ahead. At the tip rode Count Berthold of Nuremberg with a lance that weighed almost 30 pounds. Behind him, our overlapping shields made a solid wall of steel. By the time the formation was at full width, 50 yards across, it felt like a moving fortress. Chroniclers later said the whole mass of men, horses, and armor weighed over 2,000 tons. I believe them. The ground trembled under our charge like thunder mixed with earthquakes. Even veteran Turkish warriors felt their courage crack. Some tried to run. Others raised weapons out of sheer stubbornness. We covered the 300-meter distance in about 40 seconds. A destrier at full gallop hits 30 miles an hour, and the impact from a single knight is like being hit by a car. Multiply that by 500. Their front line didn't stand a chance. Our lances shattered through armor, shields, and bodies, and anything that fell was crushed under the horses behind. For about 7 seconds, though, the Sultan's elite Mamluks tried to hold. They formed a spear wall and died where they stood, but our wedge broke through them like an avalanche snapping trees. After that, the entire Turkish center collapsed. Panic spread instantly. One man running turned into 10, then 100, and before long entire units were falling apart. The battlefield became a chaos of scattered duels and desperate retreats. Count Robert of Nassau, having lost his lance, went to work with his sword, cutting down men as they fled. One Turkish commander tried rallying his troops and was trampled by 3 of our knights before he could finish shouting. Our infantry, seeing the breakthrough, surged forward with new strength. The key to saving the Turks was the Sultan's green banner. If it stayed aloft, they could still rally. Barbarossa knew it and led a direct charge at it. His personal guard, men who'd fought beside him for decades, closed ranks around him like a steel fist. The Sultan's own guards fought fiercely, but the momentum had already tipped. When the banner fell under our horses' hooves, something inside the Turkish army broke. I heard men shouting, "Allah has abandoned us." And even their elite troops dropped their weapons and ran. The Sultan himself bolted east, leaving his army to its fate. What followed was brutal and without mercy. Barbarossa allowed no quarter. Fleeing soldiers were cut down where they ran, and our infantry finished off the wounded. After weeks of torment, our men were beyond forgiveness. By early afternoon, the slaughter on the open field had already turned into a nightmare for the Turks. Around 2 o'clock, both halves of the fight slammed together. Duke Frederick's troops burst out of Iconium's eastern gate just as the broken remnants of the Sultan's army reached the city, hoping to escape. Instead, they ran straight into another wall of crusaders. Trapped between Frederick's men and Barbarossa's pursuing forces, they had nowhere left to run. What happened next wasn't a battle, it was an execution. Knights, still hot with victory, cut through them without hesitation. Bodies stacked so high they formed their own obstacles. The dirt turned to bloody mud. Even conservative accounts say 9,000 Turks died. Others claim 40,000. The truth was likely somewhere in the middle, 15 to 20,000 dead in 6 hours. The field from the city walls to the distant ridge was carpeted with corpses. Vultures would feast for weeks. Inside Iconium, the disaster only deepened. The Sultan's younger brother watched from the citadel while the capital burned. We took everything of value: grain, weapons, treasure, the famed wealth of rum that had taken generations to collect. Spices, silk, gold, more riches than starving men like us had ever imagined. And somehow we'd lost fewer than 500 men. For every crusader who fell, 30 or 40 Turks died. It was one of the most lopsided victories any of us had ever heard of. Amid the ruins, there were moments I'll always remember. Barbarossa, armor soaked in blood, found Duke Frederick near the palace. Father and son embraced right there in the rubble. I heard the emperor say, "You did well, my son." Men nearby swore they saw tears in the old warrior's eyes. Pride, relief, and exhaustion all at once. The sack of Iconium lasted through the night. Men who'd marched for days on nothing but dates and hope now stuffed themselves on captured food and drank wine like water. The whole army exploded into celebration, but Barbarossa kept enough discipline to guard the gates and hold key positions. He knew the Turks might come back with reinforcements. He wasn't taking any chances, not after what we'd survived. From the safety of his citadel, the Sultan watched everything he'd built collapse. Kilij Arslan had ruled Anatolia for 20 years, yet now he could only stare as his capital burned and his army vanished. In a single day, Barbarossa had stripped him of power, pride, and reputation. People later said that in 6 hours we killed more Turks than we had in the previous 6 months. We captured more wealth than most kingdoms owned. And we broke Turkish control of Anatolia so completely that the region never truly recovered. At dawn on May 19th, the Sultan finally surrendered. He came out under a white flag and offered anything he thought would save him: gold, hostages, food, and guides to lead us safely to Syria. His offer was enormous. 100,000 gold pieces, 500 noble hostages, and full supplies for the march ahead. Barbarossa accepted. He'd already achieved everything he came for. Across the Islamic world, the shockwaves were immediate. Iconium was supposed to be untouchable. Turkish cavalry was supposed to be unbeatable. Yet an aging emperor from the west had crushed both myths in one afternoon. From Damascus to Cairo, Muslim leaders suddenly realized the Crusaders weren't fading relics. They were still dangerous. But Barbarossa's greatest victory also set the stage for tragedy. With the Seljuk power shattered, local lords broke away, the Byzantines regained influence, and the political balance in Anatolia fell apart. Barbarossa had accomplished what far larger armies never could. He opened the land route to the Holy Land. Then fate turned cruel. Just 22 days after the battle, June 10, 1190, Frederick Barbarossa drowned while crossing the Salif River in Armenia. Some said his horse slipped. Others said his armor dragged him under. After 40 years of surviving every danger imaginable, the greatest commander of our age died in water barely waist deep. Without him, our army unraveled, and the Third Crusade took a different path. Richard and Philip would become famous, but they would never win the decisive victory Barbarossa might have delivered. Iconium ended up being his final masterpiece, Western Europe's last major triumph in Anatolia. After that, the tide in the east shifted permanently against Crusader ambitions. The battle changed how medieval warfare was understood. Barbarossa proved that disciplined heavy cavalry, used correctly, could smash any number advantage. The iron wedge became standard in Western armies. Commanders studied the psychological shock of a concentrated nightly charge. Even today, modern militaries teach Iconium as an example of how good tactics and technology can beat overwhelming numbers. Barbarossa's use of terrain, timing, deception, and psychological pressure was centuries ahead of his time and influenced everyone from Napoleon to Rommel. And yet, the deeper questions remain. Was the slaughter justified? Did the outcome excuse the methods? Barbarossa believed war came down to will. The side that breaks first loses, no matter how many soldiers it has. The Turks had every advantage but one. They were facing a commander who refused to yield. Leadership tipped the scales. At 68, Barbarossa rode at the head of the charge himself, and when the men saw him, we couldn't help but follow. He understood something most commanders never learn. Preparation, boldness, and sheer determination create their own luck. Iconium taught a lasting lesson, that impossible odds aren't impossible at all when someone chooses to challenge them. We were starving, outnumbered, surrounded by hostile lands and fortified cities. By any sensible calculation, we should have failed. Instead, 10,000 of us stood against 40,000 and reminded the world why the Iron Men of the West were feared from Scotland to Syria. Courage and strategy, not numbers, shaped that day. The ruins of Iconium still stand in modern Turkey. You can walk the same ground where Barbarossa charged and touch the walls Duke Frederick helped take. But the real monument isn't the stone. It's the lesson the battle left behind. When leadership, innovation, and willpower come together, even the hardest odds become something human beings can overcome. One afternoon was enough for an old emperor to prove that courage, cunning, and cold steel could still change the world.